There is a rising consensus that Donald Trump is not just a man who makes provocative statements and doesn't follow through. In his second term in office, what once seemed to be shock value antics are now being understood to be very real and actionable policies, sometimes with detrimental effects. In the first 100 days, the president signed a flurry of executive orders, more than any other president in that period. It was part of his mandate of putting, quote, America first, but many of his foreign policy orders have had a direct and even an immediate impact on the Middle East. He froze foreign aid, hitting countries like Egypt and Jordan that rely on U.S. assistance. He disrupted the admission of refugees into the country and imposed global tariffs on trading partners, with additional levies on Syria, Israel, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern countries. After the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on war crime charges, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on the court itself. And as the U.S. bombs Yemen relentlessly, the Houthis have once again been designated a terrorist organization. Domestically, anti-immigrant sentiment is on the rise, with much of it being linked to pro-Palestinian movements in the wake of Israel's war in Gaza and its spillover across the region. And now, a number of student protesters on American university campuses have been detained and are at risk of deportation. At the same time, we've seen efforts between the Trump administration and Arab countries, including Gulf states, to pursue new economic partnerships. And most promising of all, historic negotiations on Iran's nuclear deal have begun. So what exactly is the president's position on the Middle East? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we look back at the first 100 days of Trump's presidency and we ask what his priorities are in the region.
They said, he will start a war. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
This was the vow that President Trump made before coming into office.
I will end the war in Ukraine. I will stop the chaos in the Middle East, and I will prevent World War III from happening. And you have no idea how close we are.
And yet, it's been 100 days and the wars have not stopped. In Gaza and Yemen, they have escalated. In Lebanon, Israel is still bombing, despite a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Israel is attacking Syria and the U.S. has launched an unforgiving campaign on the Houthis in Yemen. Has the president, in fact, failed on his promise?
I think it's undoubtedly the case that the president has failed. I mean, certainly, he set himself up for failure.
This is Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.
100 days is not very long, and he set himself out for a very big and ambitious agenda. In Yemen, I think the president believes that an awesome show of American military firepower will not only help deter the Houthis from attacking shipping in the Red Sea, but really send a message to the Iranians. When it comes to Lebanon, the Biden administration wrote into the ceasefire agreement that the Israelis had the right to enforce the ceasefire by using military force. From the American perspective, I think the Israeli policy in Syria is the most head-scratching of them all. Why are the Israelis on the same side as the Iranians in Syria? I mean, there's good reason to be skeptical of Ahmed al-Shara and the HTS, but at least for now, they've done and said the right things. Why would you want to sow chaos? The long and short of this is the president has not achieved any of his goals. And for someone who ran on a platform 3 times for the White House to withdraw the United States from foreign entanglements, specifically in the Middle East, he's only gotten the United States deeper into the Middle East. He believed clearly that he had the kind of influence that is necessary to force the actors into the region to do things that they don't want to do. And the primary person that he felt that he had the kind of leverage with was the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. But when it came to Gaza, everybody who knew anything about the situation in Gaza or the ceasefire that had essentially been negotiated by the Biden administration understood that while the president's influence in December 2024, January 2025 would give him an opportunity to pressure the Israelis and Hamas into a ceasefire, that getting to a second phase of the ceasefire was going to be impossible to do.
Even though Trump had not yet been sworn into office, the credit was largely attributed to him. But can the president still claim the credit for a truce that essentially has failed since then? Mohamad Bazzi is the director of the Kevorkian Centre for Near East Studies and an associate professor of journalism at New York University. He says that Trump's priorities on Gaza have since changed.
Donald Trump continues to claim credit for the Gaza ceasefire. Now, by mid-March, or really even early March, when Netanyahu decided to restart the siege on Gaza, when on March 2nd, he banned all kinds of shipments, food shipments and aid, and restarted the Israeli siege of Gaza, that seemed to have a U.S. green light. And now it seems to have completely dropped off the Trump administration's agenda, and there's a war in Gaza again, and there's no pressure from the U.S. administration on Netanyahu to have that exit strategy. In fact, the only exit strategy on the horizon seems to be for Israel to reoccupy Gaza.
But could there still be some incentive for the president to end the war on Gaza at this point? For a moment, it might have seemed that way when U.S. hostage envoy Adam Bowler directly engaged with Hamas in March. It was an unprecedented move by U.S. officials who considered the group to be a terrorist entity.
In the grand scheme of Trump's foreign policy, it's actually not surprising because he seems to be willing to talk to anyone. Now, Israel and Netanyahu's government was particularly upset by this direct outreach to Hamas, and they worked very hard to undermine it. And eventually they did. They turned the tide against that outreach, and it collapsed. I think there are signs that the Trump administration would engage in this kind of direct talks with Hamas again if the opportunity availed itself. In many ways, Trump wants to make the grand deal. It almost doesn't matter what the content of the deal is. He wants the PR that comes out of a big deal. He wants the optics. And if he can figure out a way to sell a deal with Hamas that his own administration has reached, so in some ways even cutting Israel out, cutting the Israeli government out of a deal, specifically on the hostages. But the other problem here is that the administration has also had a very expansive foreign policy portfolio. He promised to end the Ukraine war on day one. He's being reminded of that promise, and he's now backing away, saying that he was speaking figuratively. So there's a lot of crises and wars in the world that he promised to deal with and that he hasn't yet.
In Yemen in particular, the U.S. escalated its attack on Houthi-controlled ports, and the consequences have been deadly, with ripple effects that have yet to be seen for the millions that rely on aid that comes through these ports every single day. I asked Stephen how another American war in the Middle East aligns with Trump's America First policy.
Well, it doesn't. It's a major contradiction. Yet here we are engaged in pretty significant military operations against the Houthis, which I should say that I'm actually generally supportive of taking on the Houthis. I just think that the strategy that this administration has pursued has been a bad one. And I think that the strategy that previous administrations have taken with regard to the Houthis have been a bad one. I think we didn't listen to our partners in the region who told us during the Obama years that the Houthis were fanatics and bent on destabilizing the Arabian Peninsula with Iranian help. And now here we are, 10 years later, the Houthis are better armed than they otherwise would have been. But airstrikes alone against the Houthis is extremely risky, doesn't necessarily achieve goals, and risks killing lots of people who are not being targeted by the United States. It requires an integrated strategy in which the United States works with its partners in Yemen, as well as its partners in the Gulf, the government of the United Arab Emirates, the government of Saudi Arabia, in order to put pressure on the Houthis from the ground at the same time. The air power and missile strikes never won a war. So it's a good policy being poorly executed.
The view from the Middle East is bleak. So how do Americans feel about the U.S. being directly involved in regional conflicts again?
I think that in general, after these 100 days, what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Syria, Lebanon, does not register at all for the American people. I follow it because that's my job. I think when you look at the polling, the 100 days polling, what Americans are concerned about are the president's immigration policies. It's almost as if they wanted a tough immigration policy. They wanted him to secure the southern border, but now he's gone too far. And Americans don't like what he's doing. They don't like what he's doing on tariffs because they see that prices are high and they're concerned that tariffs are going to go high. If we bomb the port of Hodeidah, I bet outside of Washington and other places, I bet 9 out of 10 people are probably unaware that the United States has done that.
The global tariffs that Trump imposed in early April are on pause for now, and trade partners in the region will be waiting to see whether he will follow through once this grace period ends. This will be especially true for Gulf states, with which there is a mutual interest to build economic partnerships.
Well, we'll see. I mean, the president is coming to the Gulf. He's going to be visiting Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And I'm guessing there is going to be a lot of announcements about investment and deals and weapon sales and so on and so forth. I don't think the Gulf itself is going to be directly affected so much by the tariffs. I think maybe indirectly affected by it. But I do think that the Gulf states, though, have been smart in that they have been making what seems like trillion-dollar bets on their own development independent of the United States. They've been working with others, China being one of them, and being generally opening themselves up and being attractive to foreign direct investment, which should shield them from the worst of the uncertainty that the president has caused as a result of a tariff policy that really no one with any kind of expertise in this area can explain.
Trump's interests in the Middle East are not a one-size-fits-all formula. He appears to have different priorities in different places. In Syria, for example, he seems to be taking more of a wait-and-see approach, at least on the surface. In Lebanon, where Israel continues to violate an American-brokered truce, we have yet to see Donald Trump take a hard stance. So where does he stand when it comes to Syria and Lebanon? I asked Mohamad.
So in Syria, it seems the Trump administration doesn't really care, unfortunately. The Biden administration cared a bit more. Trump seemed to find Syria irritating in a lot of ways. Even in his first term, he saw sort of the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad. He saw it as an irritant. He didn't particularly want to deal with it. And now in this current term, it seems to have fallen way down on their list of priorities. They're allowing Israel in many ways to take the lead on Syria, as Biden did in his final month in office as well. Israel to take more land within Syria, to create a buffer zone to its own buffers, to the existing buffer zone, and to carry out airstrikes throughout Syria basically whenever it pleased. We're seeing a less engaged Trump administration in Syria, and that has dangerous consequences because Syria needs international help to rebuild. Syria needs US and other sanctions to be lifted to get Arab countries, to get countries of the GCC to be able to follow through on helping rebuild the country, helping rebuild the economy. In Lebanon, we're seeing something similar where the Trump administration is a bit more engaged in Lebanon than it is in Syria, partly because of the ceasefire and partly because the US is a substantial part of the mechanism that's supposed to ensure the ceasefire. But we're seeing hundreds, if not, we might be more than 1,000 Israeli violations of the ceasefire now. This weekend on Sunday, we saw the latest very brazen attack on southern Beirut, on a structure building in southern Beirut. And Israel is acting with impunity. And the Lebanese government is basically left to plead with the Trump administration and to plead with Europe to help enforce the ceasefire. But Trump hasn't been interested in doing that in Gaza, and he doesn't seem to be interested in doing that in Lebanon either.
There is one front that seems promising so far: the US-Iran nuclear negotiations. Trump is first and foremost a dealmaker, as we know, but Iran also has its reasons to want a deal now.
I think that the president is absolutely inclined to sign a nuclear deal with the Iranians. He has an incentive to do it, and the Iranians have an incentive to do it. He sees himself as a great deal maker. And as long as he can say, without stretching credulity, that it's a better deal than the one that President Obama got, he'll want it. Because until this, what's going to be the fourth round, I think, the U.S. hasn't even had a technical team to talk to the Iranians, whereas with the JCPOA, they had the Secretary of Energy, who's a physicist, a nuclear physicist, talking about the deal. So I think that the president certainly has incentive to do it. I think the deployment of a lot of American force in the Middle East is part of his negotiating strategy. If you look at the president over the years, he's most rhetorically bellicose before he wants to make a deal. And that is perfectly consistent with his America First view of the world.
This is a case where Trump's transactional instincts and this bulldozer style of negotiations could actually lead to a positive outcome in the region. It could avoid war with Iran. It could help us reach a nuclear deal. And it would undermine the hardliners in Washington, in Iran, and in Israel. Iran has been weakened severely over the last year, over the last 18 months by Israeli attacks, by the loss of its proxy forces. Hezbollah has been severely weakened in Lebanon. Hamas has been severely weakened in Gaza. And Iran has lost its critical air defenses thanks to Israeli attacks. So Iran is in a weakened position and it wants a deal. It also sees Trump being unpredictable and it wants a deal for that reason as well, because Trump could well follow through on his threats to carry out US attacks at nuclear facilities.
But the road to striking a deal is a bumpy one and may even require the president to sideline his closest ally, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is internally under a lot of pressure to object to any Iranian deal.
Now the question is, what about the Israelis? What's he going to do? I think it's a mischaracterization to believe that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu like each other. They don't. There's a huge trust deficit between the two men, each one fearing that the other one is going to sell the other one out. Certainly, the president, if he believes that he's going to get a great deal and that this deal may even be his road to a Nobel Peace Prize, he would do everything possible to sideline the Israeli prime minister. But if the election had gone the other way, had we be talking about the first 100 days of a Harris administration, I suspect the Israelis already would have attacked Iran's nuclear program. I think what has stayed their hand so far is they don't know how President Trump is going to punish them. That doesn't mean that the Israelis aren't going to do it. That doesn't mean. I mean, there is a live debate in Israel about an opportunity that they have not ever had before, and that whatever Trump can dole out to them in terms of punishment would be not as bad as a nuclearized Iran or a bad new nuclear agreement.
Netanyahu and his government, and particularly Netanyahu, who has spent years working to undermine any Iranian US deal. Trump seems to be aware of that. He's aware of Netanyahu's potential role as spoiler. And I think it was very interesting that, and it was no accident, that Trump announced his plan for renewed talks with Iran earlier this month in April, while Netanyahu was sitting beside him at the Oval Office. Netanyahu had arranged this hasty visit to Washington to seek an exemption from Trump for the new tariffs on Israeli exports, Israeli products. But then Netanyahu left empty-handed about the tariffs, and he was embarrassed by Trump publicly making this Iran announcement.
The president absolutely humiliated the Israeli prime minister. He had to pay homage to President Trump in this kind of ostentatious way. And he walked away with absolutely nothing. The president said, "You get $4 billion a year from us. That's pretty good. Maybe we'll talk about tariffs." Then he said, "We're having direct negotiations on Iran." And yes, he's given the Israelis a long leash on Gaza. I think because the president has come to the conclusion that there's nothing in it for him to be pushing the Israelis on Gaza. The administration may be on the same page or just not caring about Gaza. They may be, on Syria supporting the Israelis, Lebanon. These are, in general, not to make light of anything, but these are what we would say is small potatoes. For Israel, to use another bad food metaphor, the big enchilada is Iran and the Iran nuclear program. And if the United States is going full bore in negotiations, and, Mr. Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, the lead negotiator, is coming out of these negotiations and said, "Oh, yeah, we had a great conversation with the Iranian foreign minister. Everything's going really well. The outlines of a deal." This is the worst possible thing for Netanyahu.
So there is something of a signal to Iran's leaders and really to the world from Trump out of that meeting that Trump was not going to allow Netanyahu to steamroll him in the way that the Israeli premier had done with other U.S. presidents in the past. Now, could we see a deal that includes curtailing Iranian support for the Houthis and potentially Hezbollah and sort of other proxy forces? It's possible, but so far the Iranians have been insistent that they only want to negotiate on the nuclear file and not on Iran's regional role not to take on questions about Iran's missile program. It's going to be difficult to get the Iranians in this round to negotiate on those wider issues. But there is a clock, and Trump has made it clear that he's not interested in open-ended negotiations that would last many months and that would drag on.
It's been 100 days so far, and there are many more hundreds of days to come over the next 4 years. How Trump's policies will shape the Middle East in that time will also largely depend on how well leaders in the region read the president and how astutely they can deal with him.
I think a great virtue of President Trump is that he is absolutely transparent. When he says something and he's going to do something, he's going to do it. The way in which policymakers in the region and elsewhere obviously have to deal with the president is you must take what he's saying seriously. But you also have to handle it in a way where the president isn't backed into a corner, where everybody's saying he's crazy, he's dumb, etc. Because then he will dig his heels in and try to prove everybody wrong. And we're then confronted with a situation where the United States is enabling the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which is the worst of all outcomes. So I think that, for example, when King Abdullah of Jordan went, and he sort of talked him off the ledge a little bit and said, we're going to take sick children and so on and so forth, that sort of mollified the president. I think that President Abdel Fattah Sisi, the Egyptians aren't always so nimble on this, but rather than going to Washington to try to talk, just to sort of avoid the issue and present your own plan and to show so that the president could say, you see, I got everybody's attention and now everybody's working on an issue that they were never addressing before, which is not true. But he could say, oh, that was my strategy all along. Fortunately, on Gaza, I think leaders in the region read the situation pretty well, understood, take him very seriously, but also understood how to maneuver the president. So now he's saying, well, no one's talking about forcibly moving anybody out of Gaza.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Follow our in-depth coverage and analysis of Trump's first 100 days on thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.